The wind howls through the lifeless slopes of the Yorkshire dales. There, you'll find a small stream, and if you follow it for long enough, it will lead you to a crumbling limestone cliff known as Mossdale Scar. At the foot of the scar is a dark entrance leading into a labyrinth of twisting caverns and passageways, haunted by the memory of one fateful day on June 24th, 1967. On a rainy, cold Sunday afternoon in October 1964, a man named Dave Adamson gazed wistfully outside the only window of his two-bedroom apartment in Leeds, UK. His expression was stoic. He was in a trance as he pondered the meaning of existence. On paper, Dave had everything that a 23-year-old man should have. He graduated university 1 year earlier with a degree in English literature and had recently landed a well-paying teaching job at his alma mater. In a few years, he would have enough money to buy a small house, and once he found the right girl, the two of them could start building a life together. Dave didn't want to admit this, even to himself, but deep down, he knew that something was missing, and yet he couldn't figure out exactly what that thing was. And so, not knowing the next step forward, Dave waded deep into this prison that he'd built for himself. He woke up at exactly 7:05 every morning, packed a ham sandwich and a Macintosh apple into a brown paper bag, climbed into his 1959 Ford Cortina, and drove himself to Leeds University for work. He taught 3 English classes there every day with a 30-minute break in between. Dave didn't mind literature. In fact, he quite enjoyed the work of authors like Henry David Thoreau, but his students' passive disinterest in this topic was sucking the life out of him. More days than not, he would walk to the back corner of the classroom and nudge a student awake. This annoyed him, but in honesty, Dave really couldn't blame them. They were going through the motions of life, just like he was. As Dave dreaded the beginning of a new work week in just a few short hours, his telephone rang, and this startled him out of his trance. He jolted upright, paced over to the counter, and picked up the receiver. Hello? Hey, Dave, it's Jeff. Dave had met Jeff Burrow 5 years earlier when the two of them were freshmen in university. They very quickly bonded over a shared interest in philosophy and rugby. While Dave cared deeply for Jeff and always had, there was a sense of envy there too. Jeff always seemed to have the things that Dave wanted but couldn't get. He had an exhilarating, rich lifestyle and a beautiful blonde-haired girlfriend named Gwen. Jeff was always planning his next exotic trip or learning a crazy new hobby. His latest obsession was caving. Caving, also known as potholing in the UK, is a sport centered around the exploration of the underground world. A caver can find themselves standing upright in a wide open space or crawling through a dark and narrow passageway. Over the course of one single caving adventure, an explorer will experience a wide range of life-threatening environments, most notably underground bodies of water. Dave and Jeff had spoken nearly every day when they were students, but after graduation, they began to drift apart. If Dave was lucky, he would hear from his buddy every couple of months, and the conversations were usually just Jeff recapping the latest cool thing he'd done. This made Dave hate his own life even more, but he missed his buddy and their carefree times in university. Even if Jeff did brag a little too much, Dave was always happy to hear from him. Jeff was in the midst of planning a caving expedition to the Cascade Inlet in British Columbia, Canada, and he asked if Dave wanted to join him. This wasn't the first time that Jeff had propositioned Dave with something like this, and each time, Dave had rejected the offer. He just didn't understand the appeal of caving, and in his deeply analytical mind, the risk-reward ratio just didn't compute. Before Jeff had finished the first sentence of his pitch, Dave had already silently made up his mind, as he always did. But he listened for the next 5 minutes and agreed to think things over, just out of politeness. As Dave started another week of his mind-numbing teaching routine, he thought more about Jeff's offer. Maybe the experience of trying something new could be enough to kick him out of this funk he'd found himself in. He had 2 weeks of unused vacation time and plenty of money saved in the bank to fund the trip. Over the next 3 days, he began to wrap his head around the idea of actually going. On Wednesday night, he drove home, he parked in the same spot he always did, and boldly walked over to the telephone. He called up Jeff and told him decisively that he would go on that caving trip to British Columbia. Jeff was ecstatic, and the two began making travel arrangements. Dave figured that even if he hated caving, a scenario he thought was pretty likely, it would still be a great way to rekindle his fading friendship with Jeff, who was absolutely gung-ho about the sport. The two flew from Manchester to Toronto and then on to Vancouver and finally took a small bush plane north to a town called Bella Bella, which was a 10-minute drive to the Cascade Inlet. They shared a rather dirty room at a loggers motel owned by a really rough-looking man named Walter. The two got settled into that room on the evening of November 2nd, 1964, and after some much-needed rest, they drove out to the inlet the next morning. There, they met a group of 20 or so cavers from all over the world. Jeff knew most of these people, and he introduced Dave to some of them, but Dave, who was a rather shy and awkward fellow, felt out of place. He'd never been comfortable with large groups of people, much less those he didn't know, and had nothing in common with. Just when he'd made up his mind that coming on this ridiculous trip was a huge mistake, he noticed Jeff talking to a girl. The girl had a short and slender build with curly brown hair and a glowing radiance that lit up the whole crowd. Dave caught himself staring just as Jeff beckoned him over. Jeff introduced the two of them and left them alone. At first, the conversation felt robotic. Dave had never had good luck with the ladies before, but pretty quickly, Megan Forbes' bubbly, outgoing personality smothered Dave's awkwardness, and the two dove into an effortless flow of deep conversation. They discussed anything and everything. Dave's run-in with a police officer 2 months ago, Megan's pet cat Henry, and John Steinbeck's masterpiece, East of Eden. Megan was funny, sharp-witted, and kind. Dave was smitten right from the start. Not only did they share many of the same interests, but Megan actually lived in York, UK, which was just a short drive from Dave's hometown of Leeds. Running on this new love high, Dave charged into the Cascade Inlet right behind Jeff, eager to impress his new crush. The cave was cold and dark, but for some reason, Dave felt a strange sense of peace in there. The spacious cave entrance quickly narrowed into a small tunnel where the cavers were forced to traverse on their hands and knees. Dave did get a little uneasy when he had to crawl through a rather deep puddle. He'd nearly drowned on a family vacation along the South Channel when he was 5, and ever since that day, he was terrified of water. Once he'd gotten through the puddle, Jeff sat down with him for a minute and guided him through some deep breathing exercises. Once David calmed down, they resumed the trek through the inlet until they'd reached the exit on the other side. Dave left that cave feeling exhilarated. For the first time in his entire life, he'd tried something new, pushed through discomfort, and it felt great. He gazed around the beautiful snow-covered mountains, deep green spruce trees, and glowing blue lakes of British Columbia with a renewed vigor for life. He'd found what he was meant to do. Not only that, but he'd met a cute girl, too. Before he and Jeff left later that day, Megan slipped a scrap piece of paper with her phone number into the pocket of his blue jeans. Dave walked onto the plane home, feeling more alive than ever before. At Jeff's direction, he began an intensive reading program on the sport of caving. He called Megan almost every day after work, and they picked up right where they'd left off outside the cave. Within 2 weeks, he'd driven out to visit her in York, and after a month, she was sleeping over at his place. Megan didn't have much tying her down to York. Her family lived there, but she'd had a falling out with them recently and was ready for some space. One night, they sat on Dave's couch watching a movie, and she just blurted out, "What the hell, why don't I just move in with you?" The question had been on Dave's mind too, but he was too shy to bring it up. 1 week later, she packed up all her belongings and was on the road to Leeds, this time for good. The next 2 years were pure bliss. Megan and Dave traveled the world together in search of new caverns to explore. She awakened a carefree, childlike curiosity in Dave. He liked it, and he didn't want it to stop. Ever. One evening in 1966, atop Arthur's Seat in Edinburgh, surrounded by the Scottish Highlands and the deep blue Atlantic Ocean, Dave got down on one knee. Megan started sobbing uncontrollably, but she was able to get out the one word that Dave wanted to hear. As Dave's love grew for his new fiancée, so too did his passion for caving. He lived for the adrenaline rush of squeezing through a tightly bound underground tunnel and the ensuing sense of relief and accomplishment that inevitably came after. Jeff called on an afternoon in the spring of 1967 with a proposition. He was heading up an expedition of the Mossdale Caverns, and he wanted to know if Dave would lead a team with him. The plan was to travel to the far end of the caverns and then use explosives to uncover new passageways. Had it been any other location, the answer would have been a resounding and very quick yes. At this point, Dave was as obsessed with caving as Jeff was. But Dave knew of the Mossdale Caverns. They were infamous because of a particularly difficult stretch of tunnel called the Marathon Crawl, known around the world as one of the most difficult caving challenges on Earth. Fewer people have explored Marathon Crawl than have walked on the moon, and for good reason. Besides that, the Yorkshire Dales where the caverns were located had a history of extreme storms that would cause unexpected flooding. Had Jeff asked Dave 2 years ago, the answer would have been a firm no. But Megan had changed him, mostly for the better. She pushed him to grab life by the horns and take risks, because as she put it, you might not wake up tomorrow. Still, Dave wasn't sure. The location seemed risky, and in addition to that, he had no prior experience with explosives. That made him feel uneasy. "You'll be fine," said Jeff, projecting an air of overconfidence that was all too common for him. "You just stick by my side, just like we did that first time in BC. Besides, you know Megan's not gonna miss this for the world, right?" By the end of the call, Jeff had convinced Dave, and the matter was settled. The three of them would travel to the town of Grassington on June 23rd by train, with a planned expedition for the following day, weather pending. The Yorkshire Dales have many moods. They can convey a wild chaos or a peaceful tranquility depending on the weather. Each dale has its own unique character set against the backdrop of the moorland tops. Nearly uninhabited, the area is sparsely marked with dry stone walls and farmhouses built by pioneers over the centuries who were brave enough to face this inhospitable environment. Former mine shafts and other industrial equipment serve as a reminder of the area's rich heritage, all but forgotten today. This is the setting that Dave, Megan, and Jeff found themselves in on the morning of June 24th, 1967. The three had stayed in a bed and breakfast in Grassington before hailing a taxi towards the caverns. They were dropped off as far as the driver was willing to go on that bumpy dirt road, and they finished the last bit of the journey on foot. At the mouth of the caverns, they met up with a group of 7 other cavers. June 1967 had seen an unusually long dry spell in the Yorkshire Dales, which meant less risk of flooding, which was ideal for caving. This day was no different. The sun shone down on the group outside the cave entrance as they prepared to set forth. The Mossdale Caverns are a geological freak of nature. The entrance leads into a network of 7 miles of winding tunnels. The stream that flows into the caverns seemingly disappears, only to reappear 5 miles away and 900 feet lower in an underground pool called the Black Keld. Mossdale was first explored by caving legend Bob Leakey in 1941. He actually got into the sport to get over his chronic fear of water and tight spaces, very similar to Dave. Bob had been one of Dave's greatest inspirations when he set out on his own caving career with Jeff in 1964. During the Second World War, with most British cavers away fighting the Germans, Bob Leakey stumbled upon the caverns while on vacation from his munitions factory job. Intrigued, he plunged headfirst inside, aided only by a candle. He crawled through the stone prison for 3 days, sleeping in tiny, flood-prone passages. When it seemed like there was nothing left to discover, Bob left the caverns, never to return. He later admitted that had anything gone wrong that day, nobody could have helped him. Another caving expert at the time, Jim Eyre, vowed never to go near the Mossdale Caverns, claiming that they were a death trap that young cavers, like Dave and Jeff, were taking far too lightly. Jeff had actually asked Jim to join the expedition a few weeks earlier, but Jim rejected the idea. And so, the 10 of them set out into the darkness of the Mossdale Caverns just after lunchtime. The first leg of the journey is actually rather spacious. In most sections, you can stand up, but after 45 minutes of walking, things narrow down into a web of cracks and crevices. It was at this point that 4 of the cavers, including Megan, opted to stay behind and explore the more spacious section close to the entrance. This left Dave, Jeff, and 4 others named Bill Frakes, Colin Vickers, Michael Ryan, and John Ogden to continue on, with the plan to reach the far end of the cave and begin using their blasting equipment to look for new passages. Megan watched her fiancé disappear into the blackness with an eerie unease. As Dave moved further in, he had expected a few puddles of water, which he could have handled, but as he continued on to the next section of the cave, aptly named the Knee Wrecker, he was understandably unnerved when he saw Jeff plunge into a neck-deep lake in order to travel under a section of low-hanging rock. He'd gotten much better with his fear of water over the last 3 years, but it still deeply unsettled him. The Knee Wrecker led into the infamous marathon crawl, where the men were forced to push themselves along on their bellies through a 500-meter tunnel just 10 inches high and 2 feet wide. Contemporary caver Simon Beck gives us some idea of the terror associated with the marathon crawl. Bidding farewell to the secure expanse of the mud caverns offers a sudden sickening unease. Should I wait 5 or 10 minutes more, just in case? You slide down the cobble slope and splash back down at the beginning of what feels like a long torment to come. You are back in the game again, holding far less than what you began with against a merciless and Herculean opponent. Your only play is that of chance. You offer yourself forth, and so it begins. No doubt, the 6 knew the dangers of this undertaking and certainly felt the same anxiety that Simon describes. Not only because of the claustrophobia, but also the very real danger of flooding. The group of 4 that had stayed behind left the cave at 5 p.m., and they were greeted by a light sprinkle of rain, which was surprising because the forecast had called for sun all day. As they walked back towards town, the rain intensified and they took refuge in an old abandoned barn on the moorlands. The rain hadn't let up by 7:30, and Megan, feeling a little worried for the 6 still in the cave, walked back to the entrance to check on things. But it didn't look too bad there, so she returned to the barn with the plan to wait there for Dave, who would get out of the cave on the other side around midnight. By 9 p.m., what had started as a light rain had turned into a torrential downpour, and this prompted Megan to return to the cave entrance. What she saw there horrified her. What was usually a very shallow stream leading inside had turned into a giant lake over 6 feet deep. At this point, instinct kicked in and Megan took off, running as fast as she could. She didn't know where she was running or what she was going to do when she got there, but she knew they needed help. Megan sprinted across the moor for 2 miles until she reached a lone farmhouse. Praying that someone was inside, she thumped on the door as hard as she could. Initially annoyed, a short, stocky farmer with a white beard answered the door. When he saw the horrified expression on Megan's face, he invited her inside and sat her down at his kitchen table. Once she'd caught her breath, Megan told him what happened. The farmer phoned the police, and a rescue mission was on the scene by 11 p.m. Before anyone could get inside the caverns, they had to deal with the lake of water at the entrance. They started by building a dam to cut off the flow of the stream, and then they dug a large trench to divert the sitting pool of water. The scene looked like a war zone. Excavators and tractors churned up the waterlogged soil as they worked at a furious pace. Construction crews labored through the night, knowing they were in a race against the clock. By 8 a.m. the next morning, most of the water had been diverted, and a team of rescuers, led by veteran Jim Eyre, walked into the cave. They hoped they would find the group of 6 huddled in one of the more spacious areas. Isn't it ironic that a mere 2 weeks earlier, Jim had rejected an invitation to join the expedition that he was now trying to rescue? Jim trudged through the opening tunnel, and finding no one, him and his team continued on to the Knee Wrecker, and seeing nothing there as well, they went on to the arduous slide down the marathon crawl. As Jim was nearing the halfway point, he turned off his lamp in order to save battery. He bumped into something with his head, but it wasn't the cold, wet, hard stone that he was expecting it to be. It was soft and rather squishy. Jeff turned on his headlamp, and there, staring into his eyes, were the pale, bloated faces of Jeff Burrow and Colin Vickers. Praying that there might be life further down in the cave, Jim clambered over top of the dead bodies and continued on. As he reached the far end of Marathon Crawl, he spotted 3 more bodies in the tunnel. They were Michael Ryan, Bill Frakes, and John Ogden. Knowing all 3 of them personally, Jim was deeply traumatized by what he saw. But in the midst of this death scene, he realized that Dave was nowhere to be found. After a couple more hours of searching for Dave, Jim instructed his team to exit the cave, fearing that the dam would give way and drown them too. For the entire 4-hour rescue attempt, Megan stood outside the entrance staring into the abyss. She was in a state of shock. When she heard the news of the 5, her heart sank. But after she heard that Dave hadn't been found yet, she remembered that he had led the group. Megan knew Mossdale well enough to know that there was a very spacious opening at the end of the marathon crawl. If the cavers who were behind Dave were near to the end, then maybe he had managed to get out of Marathon before drowning. It was a faint glimmer of hope, but Megan clung to it like a newborn baby for the next 18 hours, not leaving her spot outside the cave. After the dam had been reinforced, she watched anxiously as Jim and his team returned to the blackness in a desperate bid to rescue Dave. Jim returned to the spot in Marathon where the 3 had been found, and he began exploring some of the even tighter tunnels that sprang off from it. As he peered into the rocky ceiling, something caught his attention. It was the underside of a caving boot, high up in a crevice that seemed far too narrow for a human being to fit inside. As Jim inspected the scene further, his heart sank as he realized that wedged up inside this crevice was the body of Dave Adamson. Dave's body was covered in black soot, and without a careful examination, he was scarcely visible. This is why he'd been missed during the first escape attempt. 34 hours earlier, Dave crossed the midway point of the marathon crawl. He heard a sickening noise. It was his best friend Jeff screaming. With what the two of them had been through over the last 3 years, Dave recognized this scream in a second. It was not a good thing. Dave turned back in time to see the other cavers pursued by a gushing river of icy water. Acting purely off instinct, the men raced towards the end of Marathon, knowing that a spacious room full of fresh oxygen was waiting for them there, but they were not fast enough. The water levels rose at a frightening level, engulfing Jeff and Colin by the midway point. The other 3 were caught less than 50 meters from Marathon's end. Dave was the last one standing, and in a desperate attempt to breathe the last inches of air, and no doubt motivated by his intense fear of water, he squeezed his thin body into the 7-inch pocket where he was found. There, he was stuck and stood helplessly as the water levels rose, stealing the precious oxygen from his lungs in the final seconds of his life. With no easy way to retrieve the bodies, Jeff and his team left them in there, miles below the surface. Once the chaos of the tragedy had died down, the prevailing question was what to do with the bodies. Eventually, it was decided that the cave would serve as their grave. The bodies were left in place, and the cave entrance sealed up, never to be touched for the next 3 years. Megan was shattered. She was set to marry Dave just 2 weeks after the tragedy. Her world came crashing down, and she retreated into a shell of her former self, where she remained for many years. To this day, she refuses to set foot in a cave and has never spoken publicly about the event. In 1970, a group of cavers who were friends with the 6 who drowned found a new entrance, and in what must have been a horrific experience, they traveled back to Marathon Crawl, located the now 3-year-old bodies, and transported them to a more spacious tunnel above where they were buried. The landowner caught wind of this after the fact and forbid any further exploration of Mossdale. But this hasn't stopped everyone. Throughout the years, a few curious explorers have found their way back to the Mossdale Caverns through unmarked entrances. They all feel the same haunting energy that now pervades the space. Some even report hearing distant, echoing voices ringing through the passageways. So you're probably wondering why. Why would these 6 men willingly put themselves in such a dangerous situation? In a single word, escape. An unexplored cavern offers a portal to another dimension, away from the miserable monotony of modern life. The same impulse that motivated Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin to undertake the perilous moon landing in 1969 was the same thing that pushed those men deep into the bowels of Mossdale 2 years earlier. The burning desire to experience the vast, untouched corners of our mysterious universe. Fear is a dangerous thing. It can trap us in the prison of an unhappy life. But Dave Adamson showed us that we don't have to accept that reality. He's to be admired because of the incredible courage he demonstrated. The courage to charge through life, knowing that we only get one shot at it. Thanks for listening.